Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, and he's an honorary research fellow at the Cardiff University. And we are very privileged to have you. And apologize again, Damian, to wake you up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And yeah, if some of you guys can switch on the camera, that will be actually good for him and us. So yeah, Damian, they're all yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dev, for inviting me. It's great to be here. As you said, it is 6 o'clock in the morning here in Oregon, so you may well see during the course of our talk today the sunrise behind me, and you'll get to see some glorious sunshine pouring in. So let me quickly start by sharing my screen with you, and I'm also going to make sure I have the chat open here, so please do feel free to post comments and questions and observations as we go along. And of course, the session is being recorded, and I will also pass on a copy of these slides to your professor as well, so that you can have these as a reference point for later on. Okay, so here's our kind of plan of action for today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about media literacy and in particular about misinformation, which is kind of one really key area of media literacy that is attracting a lot of attention in terms of skills development, training, and also research. So alongside setting that scene, also going to look specifically about what we as journalists and as digital citizens can also do to manage misinformation and our own role in that space. It's early, and I appreciate for some of you it's also late on, sort of 6:30 in the evening, but hopefully that kind of plan of attack sounds good and you're not all feeling as in need of coffee as I am. Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself in a little bit more detail in a moment. Whilst I'm doing that, I'd love to find out more about those of you who are able to join us on the call today. So just in the chat, if you could quickly share a few quick details about yourself, that would be great. I've given some quick suggestions here. It'd be great to kind of know your name, what you were doing before you joined this 10-month program, 2-semester program, and also what you hope to do afterwards. So kind of 3 quick things: who you are, what you were doing before you took on these studies, and what you hope to do afterwards. This would be really, really interesting context and information for me. So please feel free to post information about that in the chat. Just in terms of then a bit of background about myself, as you've probably already guessed by this point, based on my accent, if nothing else, then I'm not originally from the US, where I'm speaking from to you from today. I am originally from the UK. Here's a few quick pictures of my family, various members of this family, this being Zoom era, may well join us on the call today, from my cat Oreo to my 3 children, and who knows, our baby might also wake up around about this time, so I may end up dashing out to grab him and pass him to his mum. So we'll see. Real life has a habit of intervening and intruding in these types of Zoom sessions. But here's a little bit more about my kind of professional background. I think one of the things that's interesting about this, and perhaps kind of quite unique, is the fact that I've worked across all different media platforms, starting in radio, moving then to TV and digital, and that I have also done so across all different sectors. So starting in commercial media, but also working in the public sector for public media, for regulators, for NGOs, and now working as an academic, but also as a journalist, as a freelance journalist and trainer and researcher alongside that. As your professor kindly mentioned at the beginning, I sport a lot of different kind of hats in terms of some of the relationships that I have with journalism schools on both sides of the pond, in the US and also in the UK. And I thought it might be useful to just kind of pull together some examples of places that I have written for, provided training for, or been interviewed for as part of my work. And I've kind of just put together some examples here. You might recognize some of these names and brands. In terms of some of the research work that I do, I'm not a kind of typical academic. I'm a professor of practice, and my focus is very much on practice and on practitioners. So a big focus on kind of looking at what's happening in newsrooms, what's happening on the business side of journalism and media, how that's changing and evolving, and how to make sense of it. And the audience for that are practitioners like yourselves. And here's some examples of some recent reports here. The one on the bottom left, looking at innovation in news media and journalism, was one I was very fortunate that Professor Rajaram also participated in as one of my expert interviewees. Here's some examples of some of the things that I am working on. So some of those are kind of updates to previous studies, and then also some new things focusing on topics like community-centered journalism, but also kind of big global press trends that we're seeing across the world right now. And then in terms of my teaching, I mostly focus on reporting, the business of journalism, and then particular areas of specialism on things like how to use social media for journalistic purposes, and also podcasting and audio storytelling, which is something I'm very passionate about, having started my career in radio a long, long time ago. And then the last couple of things, just wanted to sort of highlight some examples of places around the world where I've been fortunate enough to speak about my research and my experience as a journalist. Got some examples on screen here. And lastly, some places where I have delivered training on a variety of different topics, and I've been very fortunate to speak to some of you guys before. You'll see on here that this mentions Fulbright, the Fulbright program, which is run by the Department of State here in the US. And this talk that I'm going to give today, focused on media literacy and misinformation, is one that originally started as a training session for Fulbright scholars and Fulbright educators who were about to embark on placements all around the world, but with a particular focus on Eastern Europe. So the reason I kind of give you that background is because not only do I sport a number of different hats, but I think one thing that's really interesting when I look at all of those different areas is that both as a journalist, as someone training the next generation of journalists, and also somebody engaging in research work, there is a consistent underlying theme about issues around misinformation, of trying to understand how audiences consume and find and access information. And also then what our responsibilities are as journalists to be able to manage and to navigate that. So given that this is a theme that comes up kind of time and time again, it's really exciting to have the opportunity to talk about that with you here today. Now, before I go into some of the specifics of things we talked about earlier on, we should very quickly address the important and significant elephant in the room. The thing that everybody always wants to know is, are you related to Harry Potter star Daniel Radcliffe? So let's get that one out of the way first. Yes, I am. We are cousins, and that's something that everybody always wants to know and is kind of a little bit shy about asking. It's been a slightly kind of interesting relationship with Dan over the years. It's kind of well known that during his late teens, early 20s, he had a few problems, but he's come out the other side of that doing incredibly well, and going to be starring as the American singer Weird Al Yankovic in a film coming out pretty soon, which is looking really, really good. So that's the elephant in the room. That may well be some of your reaction to this, but now we've talked about that, let's get back to the main matter in hand, media literacy and misinformation. So just a reminder, this is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Just also a quick reminder, by the way, if you are joining us, if I can ask you to mute your microphones, it's there's a lot of kind of background noise whilst I'm talking. That would be great, please. But don't be shy about posting things in the chat if you want to communicate with me. So we're going to talk about definitions, focus on misinformation, focus on tips and tools, and lots of opportunity for questions. And my hope is that this is going to be kind of very practical and actionable for all of you. So if anything I'm talking about doesn't make sense as I'm going through the session today, please feel free to post a question in the chat. I'm monitoring that whilst I'm talking, and I'll address any kind of questions as we go along. Okay, let's get cracking, shall we? So first of all, I said we'd start by talking a little bit about definitions. Well, what we mean by media literacy has kind of changed and evolved as our media habits have also developed, particularly over the course of the last 20 to 30 years. Here's an early definition from the 1990s from the Aspen Institute here in the US, which, I'm not going to read what's on the screen here, kind of fairly basic, fairly straightforward, the ability to access, evaluate, and create media. That has started to change and become more sophisticated as the variety of platforms that we have access to has developed, and indeed the number of tools that we have at our disposal to be able to access media has also changed and developed. So the shift has gravitated away from being able to sort of not just access and analyze, but also focus on issues like self-expression as a part of that mix. My former employer in the UK, Ofcom, the UK communications regulator, had this definition when I was working for them around about sort of 15 years or so ago. That too has changed and evolved as they continue to research this space. And here's part of how they now define media literacy. And I've just highlighted in bold the bit at the bottom that I think is most important and significant to our conversation today, which is the ability to manage content and communications and protect yourself and your family from potential risks. And that's really where the misinformation element of this comes into play. So lots of different definitions of what we mean by media literacy, but there tends to be a number of different kind of core elements that are weaved into this. Issues and questions around access to media, which is not just the ability, its availability, but also questions of media plurality. Are there a variety of different sources, for example, that you can access to be able to consume media and consume media from a variety of different sources? Being able to understand the media that you are exposed to, so critical thinking, understanding how media and how journalism works, and also being able to navigate potential harms and risks that can be associated with the information that we are exposed to. And a lot of that concern, of course, rooted in our usage of social media and social networks. So let's dive into the meat of the conversation today, which is talking about misinformation. Now, this is a topic that has really kind of grown in terms of public awareness, public concern, but also effort and resources that are being invested in this space from fact checking through to research and indeed conversations like the one that we are having today. And this really emerged as a major source of contention, certainly in the US, and that's going to be the focus of a lot of my conversation today, although with a lot of cross-cutting themes that are very relevant to you in India and to other parts of the world as well. So, we saw accusations during the course of the 2016 election by then candidate Trump of fake news and a kind of fake news agenda, using that often as an opportunity to kind of lash out against reporting that he disagreed with. But this was a term that has been picked up and popularized at all different levels. When I talk to local journalists and ask them if they've been accused of fake news, they tell me overwhelmingly, yes, they have on a regular basis. And we've seen this term popularized around the world in Turkey, Brazil, and many, many other countries. And as a result, this has kind of sowed seeds of doubt into the levels of trust that we can place in the mainstream media and information that we have access to, making it very difficult for many people to determine, well, what constitutes the truth and what is not, what is fact and what is fiction. And this is a global issue. I mentioned that many of my examples today are going to be US based, given the fact that this is where I am. But what we're talking about is a ubiquitous global problem. So this is some data from the annual digital news report produced by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. And I appreciate that if you're viewing this particularly on a phone, this will be hard to see. But what you can see here is just kind of breaking down on a regional basis, large percentages, almost kind of 50% of their sample, and this is a sample of 90,000 people around the world, saying that they have been exposed to false or misleading information in the last week around COVID, politics, and then also other kind of topics like celebrities, climate change, and so forth. I know one area of particular concern in India is scams, and that a high percentage of people saying that they've been exposed to that across WhatsApp groups and other online fora. So I'm curious, as we think about our ability to navigate this space, how confident you feel as journalists and as digital citizens of being able to navigate this space. So a quick question for you to address in the chat, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident do you feel in terms of your ability to manage and navigate misinformation? 1 would be, no, I'm not very confident at all. And 10 is, Damian, I'm so good at this and so confident about this, I should be giving this talk and not you. So just quickly post the number from 1 to 10 in the chat. I'm really curious to see kind of where on the spectrum you might be. So we've got 5, 6, 7. So a number of people kind of posting kind of fairly kind of middle. Another 5 there. Great. This is helpful to see. Yeah, I would probably post in a similar place as well. So most of you verging on sort of like 5, 6, 7. So confident, but recognize that there is always scope to know more and to be able to develop your skills further in this space. Great. Thank you for sharing that, because that's really interesting. Now, it's interesting for a number of different reasons. One, I think it just emphasizes the importance of the conversation that we're going to have today, both in terms of the information I want to share with you and also the Q&A that we're going to have at the end, but also because there's interesting research which suggests that if you are overconfident in terms of your skills in this space, and I don't think anybody in the chat would be guilty of that, then it shows that actually you are among the most susceptible people to misinformation, because you're not necessarily treating things as skeptically as you should, and that overconfidence means that you might be more inclined to share things than many of you who kind of feel confident but not too confident and not too bullish in this space. What do we mean then by misinformation? I'm going to give you some examples of that and a little bit about kind of how it spreads. This is some information that was produced by Claire Wardle, formerly of First Draft and now at Brown University. I'm not going to read these definitions, but she talked about the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, 3 different types of kind of false information that can be floating around the internet and the digital ecosystem. And the significant thing here, I think the most important element when looking at these different definitions, is really about the intent of that information. You know, is it material that is being shared by accident? Is it material that is deliberately being created and shared and discussed with an intention to do harm? Trying to understand the motives behind this misinformation is really important. And in terms of how this emerges, well, there's a variety of kind of different mechanisms for this, from the likes of sort of 4chan and 8chan, other places on the anonymous web, closed networks like WhatsApp groups, which have been kind of huge sources of misinformation and the spread of that. And then the role of conspiracy communities, the way in which material passes through our social networks, and how us as journalists in the professional media can potentially amplify that, sometimes creating a bigger problem than might otherwise be the case. And that's a theme that I'm going to come back to. And just as there are kind of different types of misinformation and disinformation to be aware of, it's also really important to understand what this might look like. And there's 7 different types of misinformation that First Draft identified and defined. Everything from kind of like satire, satirical content, to material that is more purposefully, intentionally harmful, like imposter content and kind of other material. Just understanding a little bit about kind of what this material is, where it came from, is really important to understand, as we also try to navigate how it gets kind of picked up and perhaps potentially popularized. And the motivation is part of this. I've already talked a little bit about this. You know, it really matters, because often misinformation might be unintentional and might not be likely to cause harm, but in other cases, the opposite is true. That is very much designed to cause harm or to push a particular kind of partisan point of view, and misinformation can of course tip over into things like propaganda. So let me give you some examples of some of those different elements in practice. False context is the first of these, and this is one of the most common, where we'll see examples of material which, like footage, for example. There's a lot of concern about fake photographs, fake video, and so forth, where often that material is undoctored and is correct, but the context that is applied to it is false, and so the misinformation stems from how that material is used, how that source material is used. So here's an example from back in 2016, when looking at the election there, candidate Trump was talking about the fact that, was talking a lot about the fact that his rivals were bussing in people to protest at his rallies, and that there was a deliberate campaign to suggest that large numbers of people were against him. One of his supporters, you can see this here in the tweet on the left, Eric Tucker, was at a conference in Austin, Texas. He believed this narrative that the candidate was putting forward, and when he saw a bunch of these buses, this was the tweet that he put out saying, you know, these are anti-Trump protesters here in Austin. In actual fact, these were buses that had been laid on by a company called Salesforce that were taking their staff from various hotels to a convention that they had put together. So the footage, the pictures that Tucker had taken were real, were genuine, but the context that they applied to them were incorrect. And what's really striking, I think, about this example was not just a case of somebody believing a narrative that was being put forward by a political candidate, seeing evidence around them and putting that into the context of this false narrative. But also they had very little social media following at the time that they shared this. And yet this tweet went viral, and you can see here 16,000 retweets, 14,000 likes. When they realized they'd made a mistake, they did correct it, but the correction got very little traction. Instead, it was this false narrative that continued to play into the kind of wider themes and discussions that the candidate were putting forward, and that his fans and supporters believed that was the story that people took from this event. And there are more recent examples of this. So I've got some examples from Ukraine, because that's certainly dominating much of the news agenda in Europe and the US. So very real footage here of President Zelensky out with Ukrainian troops, but the footage is 3 years old rather than something that is more contemporary. And then this is an example that we see kind of time and time again. I am not familiar with the game Arma 3, but if you are, you'll find that this game footage, which looks surprisingly realistic, is getting a lot of traction on social and being applied to a variety of different contexts, from what's happening in Ukraine to Kashmir and other places around the world. This isn't even real footage. This is screenshots and video recordings of people playing a game that people believe actually is activity that's happening on the ground. And here's just another example. This was from yesterday, as I was just putting together some fresh elements for these slides of an example from Alt News, India fact-checking website. Very real footage of an explosion in a mosque in Kabul in Afghanistan, but the footage is 3 years old, but being applied to a context today. Some quick other examples of misinformation in practice. So poor journalism, bad reporting, kind of mistakes that come in can create misinformation and misleading material. A good example from the early days of the Trump administration, when it had been reported that President Trump had removed a bust of Martin Luther King from the Oval Office. That was not the case, and the journalist who reported this corrected this as quickly as possible. But what we saw here was that even though there had been a correction, the correction didn't necessarily get the traction that you perhaps they would have hoped for. And the narrative that was brought into here was, well, here's an example of why you can't trust the news media. You know, they've owned up and made a mistake, which is a good thing for us to do as journalists, to issue corrections. However, if you were already distrustful of the mainstream media, this was just another example to support that existing viewpoint. I used this picture earlier on when I was just kind of providing a quick introduction about myself. This is an example from the Daily Mail, most popular news website in the world. They ran a very early story about people working from home, and I had tweeted a picture saying, I'm not sure who is happiest about the fact that I'm going to be working from home as a result of the pandemic? My cat or my children? And I posted this picture of my daughter Nyla with our cat Oreo. And this got picked up through a Twitter search and turned into this article on the Daily Mail. And as you can see, it points out that this is my son with our cat. But I didn't at that point have a son. My son now is 11 months old. This was just an assumption made by the fact that there was a baby wearing blue. No attempt at fact checking here, no attempt to reach out to me to verify this. And I'm very open about my family online. So it would be very easy to ascertain if you'd done even 2 minutes worth of due journalistic diligence, the fact that I had daughters rather than a son. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's kind of no harm done here, but this is just another example of kind of like poor, lazy journalism that could actually have been very quickly avoided. Third example I want to give you, fake websites, ones that look very real, but are not. So there's an example here of ABC News, one of the major news networks here in the US, abcnews.com being their URL, but abcnews.com.co being an example of a fake news site that looked pretty much like the real thing. It was really only the URL that gave it away. And there's been a bunch of examples of this similarly in India. So you saw last year, a number of really, really well-known Indian news websites and portals being recreated by companies that were essentially trying to kind of fish for your personal details, and really hard to potentially be able to spot the difference between them. So this is a global issue here in terms of fake websites. Similarly, conspiracy theories from kind of QAnon and Pizzagate. We've seen these really kind of increase over the course of the past couple of years as a result of COVID, but also concerns around topics and areas like 5G technology. Got some examples here on screen of some of the kind of conspiracy theories that we're seeing online and in popular discourse. And then the last example I want to highlight is humor, parody, satire, which we see a lot of this material online kind of taken out of context. People don't get the joke, or they assume something that they've seen that's been kind of said with a straight face is true and is accurate. And then often this is being very widely reported. So, here's an example here from the US, kind of like early example, and then some of a tweet that somebody created that was just meant as a joke. It got picked up by a wide variety of different media outlets, even got referred to by the company themselves. And then the denial got some pickup. But as we know as journalists, often corrections gain much less traction than the original story, which is why it's so important for us to get the story right in the first place, because people's first exposure to an issue or a topic, a story, tends to be what sticks with them. Here's again some local examples of this, of sites that you'd think from the name and the fact that their Twitter bios also very clearly list the fact that these are kind of satire or parody accounts, would be enough for people to realize that material being shared from them is false. It's designed to make us laugh, but in many cases, elements of these stories are being shared as fact. So there's some examples of different ways in which we're seeing misinformation being disseminated, and kind of some of the reasons and kind of rationale from it. Alongside this, we also have to be aware of the fact that authoritarian regimes, dictators around the world, are very aware of the power of social media in particular, and are often using that to push their own specific agenda. And this, again, is another area that is a source of considerable concern amongst policymakers, researchers, and indeed digital citizens. And just to remind us of how global this concern is, here's some data from earlier on this year from Edelman, the PR company, talking about concerns about false information and fake news. And you can see that India here is pretty high on this list. But across the board, you've got 2/3, 3/4 of people saying they really, really worry about this, and often with very good reason. This data is a few years old now. This is the most recent information I could find in terms of concerns specific to India, but concerns around facts being pushed and spun towards a particular agenda, concerns about poor journalism. I've already talked about that. Stories that are made up, and then things like the use of fake news being used to discredit news media and reporting that perhaps doesn't align with your point of view or the point of view that a particular political party might want to propagate. All of this has sped up and been accelerated during the course of the past couple of years during COVID. There was a lot of concern, particularly early on, about what this new virus meant, what were the implications of the pandemic, and that really kind of laid the foundations for there to be considerable misinformation kind of spread online. And interestingly, according to some academic research, India has been a kind of real hub for this. At one point during the first 18 months of the pandemic, it's believed that 1 in 6 people of false information online actually stemmed from India. Now, part of that is because this is a country with over a billion people, and a lot of people are connected. But also, I just think it's just interesting to see the volume of information and concerns that were floating around from misinformation, from everything from drinking hot lemon being a potential cure to people advocating that vegetarianism was a route forward. So Sachin Tendulkar, for example, being falsely quoted as saying, close meat shops and then we'll be able to curtail the spread of COVID and so forth. Many of these ideas that were emerging from India were also seen in other places around the world. And here's some examples of where people found false information and kind of where they tried to find correct information about COVID in India. So the importance of trusted sources, of WhatsApp conversations with friends and family and kind of other groups that people might be in. Themes that we're seeing across the board, but I thought this kind of a local context might be of interest. And this could have very, very real consequences when we're talking about a public health pandemic. Misinformation can force people to do things that might actually put them at harm and in harm's way. So in Iran, we saw people taking alcohol because they believed that could kill COVID, and many people being hospitalized and killed as a result of that. We saw then President Trump promoting an anti-malarial drug as a potential cure for this, even though at the time there was no evidence to suggest that was the case. And because the President of the United States is an incredibly important, powerful position, when that role is being used to push a particular medication, particular ways of potentially navigating COVID, people around the world listen to that. So this medication was taken by people all around the world, sometimes to their detriment. So some examples in Nigeria here of people who were hospitalized as a result of an adverse reaction to this medication that they took to prevent COVID, but actually without the science suggesting that it would be beneficial to them, actually it ended up being harmful to them. Here's an example from AFP, the French news agency, of just some of the ways in which they've tried to kind of debunk elements of this misinformation and kind of using visuals as a way to kind of grab our attention. And another example of where India is top of the charts, not necessarily in a good way, of some data conducted by YouGov from 24 different countries around the world, asking, well, where do people believe that COVID is a myth? And India kind of coming top of that. So this is a real challenge for policymakers, for health officials, for journalists and for governments to be able to kind of punch through and kind of puncture that balloon of misinformation if there's a large percentage of the population who don't believe that this is actually a potential real threat and are therefore less likely to abide by public health controls and considerations. Alongside that, one of the other issues that we saw emerge during the start of the pandemic was a desire to control the narrative that was being spread about COVID in specific countries and the government response to that. So what we've seen as part of that response has been the emergence of new legislation, new different controls on the work of journalists and the freedom of the press. often kind of set up through the guise of sort of fake news regulations, whereby individuals and media outlets can potentially be punished as a result of sharing false, misleading and misinformation, which in principle sounds great. But as we've already talked a little bit about, what constitutes false and fake can in itself be sometimes difficult to determine, particularly in a very kind of like politicized space. And so there was rightly a lot of concern that these rules and regulations have been set into place which, in a way that makes it more difficult for journalists to do their jobs, and make it difficult for them to question official responses to the coronavirus and to understand kind of what's really happening on the ground. And I know that that's a concern many of you will share and have been aware of in your own work. None of this is new. I'm going to give you some very quick historical examples where we've seen many of these same elements that we've seen over the course of the last couple of years come into play. So back in 18th century Europe in the 1700s, there was a lot of concern as the printing press became more mainstream about false, misleading misinformation being published. And so one example of somebody responsible for this is mentioned here on screen, who would just shut down their printing presses and relocate to a different city. And this is exactly the same thing that we're seeing happening online. Somebody might get banned from one platform and they just open up elsewhere, or a site gets blocked or shut down. It's so easy to create another one on WordPress or Tumblr or Medium or elsewhere. So similar principles just being deployed in a different, more modern context. Concerns about fake news and propaganda in the US back in the 1780s, and manipulated imagery, this from just over 100 years ago in the UK. A couple of children said that they'd seen fairies at the bottom of their garden, and here was the photographic evidence to prove it. And a lot of people bought into this. And in actual fact, these were cardboard cutouts that the children had created and taken photographs of. But this kind of use of manipulated imagery is something that we, of course, see on the web now as a tactic for misinformation. It's more than 100 years old. And why is this emerging now? And I'm going to give you 10 quick reasons, and then we'll talk about some of the kind of principles of things we can do to control misinformation. Well, first is to say, when we think about the way in which we consume our news, increasingly it's on social media and it's on social channels. And when we're looking through our feeds, it's very, very difficult to discern between fact or fiction. Everything looks the same. So that satirical news story versus that real life news story, they look exactly the same in our feed. So a lot of the visual cues that we might have been taken and removed, which makes it very hard for us to differentiate between kind of false news stories, some of which might be harmful, and what is actually more correct and accurate journalism. We know that that technology is and that most social platforms are driven by algorithms, and those algorithms don't discern between what's kind of fact or what's fiction. Often when things are flagged as being potentially misleading or so forth, they've already been in the mainstream and been shared millions of times before it gets to that particular point. And of course, algorithms don't necessarily share with us what is correct or accurate. They reinforce our existing points of view. So if you are inclined to believe, for example, that COVID is a myth, and you've been sharing and commenting on stories with that theme, you're more likely to see material in your social feeds that reinforce your existing worldview rather than ones that might puncture it. There is concern, although perhaps a lot of this has been overblown, about the kind of like the role of bots, of fake news being created by fake people, being propagated by fake people. We do certainly know that there's been the weaponization of the internet by particular interest groups, and even by nation states and kind of like other actors like that, to push particular points of view. And it's also fair to say that in many different countries around the world, we've seen a reduction in the number of journalists, the number of roles that are available for journalists, as the traditional business model of advertising that has supported and funded journalism has migrated away from sources like newspapers in particular and to the web. So with fewer journalists to report, and to correct misleading misinformation, it is so much easier for that material to gain traction. 5 other quick trends that I want to very quickly highlight. We should be alive to the fact that trust in journalism globally has been under decline and under attack. So again, even if people are seeing material from trusted sources in their feeds and other ways in which they consume media, they might be less inclined to believe the accuracy of it than they were a few years ago. And this is, again, a global problem. An example here from Edelman's Trust Barometer research. 2/3 of people are saying that journalists and reporters are purposefully trying to mislead people. In many countries, so the UK, where I'm originally from, we're finding that both society and our media is becoming more partisan. Very, very hard for us to fall upon kind of common truths and things that we can agree on. And here's another example of that in practice, of both that partisanship and declining trust in media. You can see here in the US kind of big divides in terms of how people trust the mainstream media based on your political persuasion. I talked a little bit about how the early phases of the pandemic were resulted in a number of efforts to kind of control the media, often through a kind of guise of wanting to manage misinformation, but in many cases actually making it harder for journalists to be able to do their job. And we've seen this trend over a period of time that kind of globally there is reduced media freedoms. It's harder for journalists to be able to do their job, to be able to question people in authority, to have access to sources and documentation and so forth. And that has potentially worrying consequences, both in the long term, but also in terms of short-term reporting on public health matters. You probably know this already, but in terms of how India performs in this space, it's ranked 150th out of 180 based on Reporters Without Borders and their annual survey. And here's the putting that in context for some of your neighboring states. And here's just some examples of some of the challenges that journalists are facing, which will be very familiar to you, which is used in RSF's latest report, talking about violence against journalists, concerns around kind of partisan media, and also concentration in media ownership, so kind of lack of media plurality, that all make it arguably harder for journalists to be able to do their job. Bound up within so much of this is the desire, particularly from governments and people in authority, to try to control the message of media. And then lastly, I want to highlight the example of the fact that this is all becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of misinformation that we might be being exposed to. This is a little video here of a deep fake. This is from the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. But instead of it being Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, as Nicolas Cage. It's kindly convincing, isn't it? Alongside videos, we're seeing misinformation happening on a variety of different platforms. I'm not going to play this TikTok video, but I'll share with you the link to it. But misinformation on platforms like TikTok is rife, and then also the emergence of issues like memes and kind of other forms of internet culture as potential ways to spread misinformation. This quote here from Donald Trump gained huge amounts of traction amongst anti-Trumpers. In actual fact, it's something he never said. Similarly, the material that you're seeing there related to Joe Biden and his son, also incorrect. But interestingly, there's research that suggests that if we take an image and a quote, our brains are more likely to believe it than if we just saw a quote in isolation, which I think is quite interesting. So that's also something to be aware of, the fact that misinformation, types of misinformation are changing and evolving and being found across a wider variety of spaces and places than ever before. Okay, I appreciate we've gone through a lot and I've already talked a lot. I'm going to just end by talking a little bit about, well, what can we do as journalists and as digital consumers to try to navigate this? So a quick question for you, another one for you in the chat, which is to ask, well, who do you think is responsible for this? So if you were to think of kind of like one organization or entity that is most responsible for fixing challenges and problems related to misinformation, who would it be? please post your answers in the chat. So you might say it's government, it's regulators, it's tech companies, it's journalists, it's us as individuals. You may have other ideas and suggestions. Where does responsibility lie in this space? Okay, us as individuals, says Anjali. Ishvarya says regulators and journalists, brilliant. Kaushik says tech giants. Okay, so we're already seeing, like, just with the first three answers that have come through here in the chat, different answers and responses. Navneeta saying the audience who consumes it. So just in your answers, we can already see this is complex. Even as a cohort here, you will have different views about who should take the lead on this. And of course, you're all right. All of those different elements need to come into play. This is some data from a couple of years ago, looking specifically at how do Indians think this should be managed. And I think it's really interesting that at that time, this is back in 2019, the population saying actually news organizations, journalists, the majority of the responsibility falls on them. And so that presents many challenges for us, but government agencies, fact-checking organizations also being popular in this mix. So how do we navigate this? I wanted to give you kind of 10 quick recommendations to end with today. So the first is ask another quick question for the chat, which is, where do you get your news from? What's your top news sources? I'd love to get some examples of organizations, companies, websites, platforms that you use in the chat. And it'd be really interesting, I'm sure, for you to see one another's answers as a part of this. So we have social media, Reuters and AP, Al Jazeera and the BBC, Twitter. Great, so already seeing a diversity of different news sources here amongst you as a cohort. Do keep those answers coming through. They'll be interesting to see. I think, as you're already showing, it's important for us as journalists and even as non-journalists to consume widely, to develop a list of sources that we trust. And that's going to be everything from, as Mohammed talks about here, kind of independent media sources, through to kind of international organizations like the AP, the BBC, and others, more localized national sources. So Mahima mentioning like the Hindu and small independent outlets. So consuming widely is important. It's important as part of this that we understand the source. So do you know that who owns a particular publication that you are researching? If it's an international outlet, does it have a particular agenda? Here's an example of a story I've posted online that's from a satirical news site that a number of different organizations assumed was factually correct because it looks like a real news site. It goes back to one of the themes I mentioned earlier about being able to discern between fact or fiction when we're viewing content online. If you kind of dig deep, you can see that this is a satirical news website, but it's not necessarily obvious. Here's some examples of Facebook groups that have a particular agenda and are kind of pushing particular material, news and information online. If you know what that is, it's so much easier to be able to navigate this. Thirdly, it's really important for us to double check everything. We know this is as journalists kind of fundamentally, but it's so important not just on the stories that we are reporting on, but also in terms of what we are consuming and what we're sharing, excuse me, to check the veracity of what we're seeing. So this is an example on the left-hand side, Associated Press, an explosion at the White House. Anybody remember when this happened? No, because it didn't. But this is a legitimate tweet from a very legitimate news source, the Associated Press, the AP. This happened after a journalist opened a phishing email, which allowed hackers to be able to control their computer, which included being able to access the official AP account. So people who were sharing this saw this online, thought, well, this is from AP. It must be correct. It must be accurate. I'm going to share it. I'm going to comment on it. Oh my goodness, isn't this terrible? Whereas, of course, the correct response would be to say, okay, AP is reporting this, but are Reuters, AFP, NBC News, the BBC, Al Jazeera, any number of other sources also reporting it? Taking your information from a single source, even a credible one, can potentially be fraught with difficulties for a variety of different reasons, including in this occasion, the fact that they'd actually been hacked. Misinformation can spread from kind of public figures who putting particular information and news kind of out in the public domain that is potentially false. These tweets are still up there. So I saw this yesterday, last night, a tweet from Pretty Gandhi with a quote about Prime Minister Modi from Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and picked up as kind of to reinforce support for him. That tweet is still there, still in the public domain, but it is false. And even though there was a correction issued by WikiLeaks, which is also still in the public domain, for a number of people kind of still believe that this is something Julian Assange said. So important for us to be skeptical in terms of what it is that we are seeing and being exposed to. And that applies to everything from kind of WhatsApp groups that we might be part of to kind of images that we see, elsewhere. And, you'd look at an image like this, which is from Instagram, and say, it's pretty obvious that surely that this is false. But there's a ton of people who commented on it saying, this is really irresponsible. You as a pilot taking selfies and so whilst you're in the air and so forth. And yet, pause for a minute. Clearly, the picture is ridiculous. Look more closely. You can see in the reflection in his sunglasses, the tarmac from the airport. Not only that, go to the actual image and go to the caption itself. And the person who is sharing this picture is clearly saying that this is false. And yet a number of people bought into the fact that this was a genuine image and shared it accordingly. Images can be manipulated. That's pretty harmless, arguably, but here's an example from the US back in 2016. Suggestions which were then emerged in 2020, and we'll see again in future elections, that illegal immigrants were voting. So here was an example of an image that was being shared online, and discussions here around immigration officials arresting people who are trying to vote illegally. Actually, it's a composite of two different photographs, but being shared and propagated by those who bought into this belief that illegal immigrants were voting online. If there's one particular skill that I would really advocate that you learn, if you don't already know how to do it, and if you do, just get really well versed in it, it's being able to reverse image search, something that you can do not just online, but also via your phone. And I've got some kind of screenshots here of how to be able to do that. Reverse image search enables you to understand how is this image and a particular image being used online, and in particular enables you to understand when did this first appear online. And that can be incredibly useful in terms of navigating some of the kind of false context issues that we've talked about before, of a legitimate real image but one that's being employed incorrectly. If we're able to trace the provenance of that image, of that imagery, to when it first appeared online, that enables us to understand whether it's being used in a correct context or not. It's tempting in this day and age, particularly when we can kind of share information so quickly and easily via devices like our phones and elsewhere, for us to kind of do so at the moment we see something that pushes our buttons. I encourage you all to kind of slow down, kind of think before you tweet, and kind of do your due diligence before you're sharing news and information. This is particularly important as stories break. We know as journalists that breaking news can be a confusing space. So just kind of being cognizant of the material that we're sharing. Here's an example of a story that gained considerable traction a few years ago of soldiers on an island in Ukraine who some people said went down fighting, others said they got captured. The real details of this were incredibly murky. It was really hard to ascertain kind of what kind of really happened on the ground here. But a lot of the narrative that people have bought into and believe and will remember about this is based on actually inaccurate reporting at the beginning that kind of very quickly went viral on social. So thinking about Where we see that information, is it on our social feeds or kind of more other kind of credible sources? And you've given some examples of places that you would go to that you believe are credible. Thinking about your reactions to this, I've talked about fake news and misinformation kind of pushing our buttons. And often that's very deliberate by people who are creating or sharing misinformation. They want to produce a strong emotional kind of passionate response. They want to to be incensed by something, or to really believe and be passionate about something that you've seen, and to kind of really buy into it, to see something that you are 100% endorse, and therefore because of that you're very quickly resharing it. Wherever you are on that spectrum, a strong emotional response is really dangerous, and something that we have to kind of guard against in terms of navigating misinformation, because we're more likely to share something impulsively without thinking about it if it outrages us, or if it's something that we really truly passionately believe in. So I've just got some quick examples of that here. So this got a lot of traction. This was a girl telling then President Trump that he was a disgrace, and people who were never Trumpers, they liked this and they shared it, but actually it was an impersonator. They shared something that just simply bought into their existing point of view. And there are other examples of this in terms of false context information here that I haven't got time to go through here. But just be wary of things that kind of push your buttons. And then the last two examples of things I want to highlight is just the importance of not just going back to that first point of having a suite of sources that we access and we buy into, but also kind of being aware of what are the kind of fact-checking websites that we can access, either on kind of global issues, but also kind of like more localized ones. What are the fact-checking pages that we might find of particular kind of like trusted sources, like the Times of India, outlets like Alt News and others. And lastly, I want to emphasize that it's really important for us to kind of question authority figures, and not necessarily to just kind of buy into what someone says because they have a platform, because they might be wearing a suit or in a position of authority or so forth. So what that means is that when a white man of a certain age with a certain professional job turns up and tells you that he's related to Harry Potter star Daniel Radcliffe, it's not necessarily true. So just to end, a reminder that it's really hard to discern between fact or fiction, because false information and real information spreads in exactly the same ways. So being critical consumers of the information that we consume, being aware of how false and misinformation can spread is really important. And I hope that the tips and suggestions I've given you today will be useful for you to be able to apply to your work as journalists, but also as digital news and information consumers. Thank you very much for having me. Now, Dev, do we have time for questions? I'm sorry, I've overrun massively.
Yeah, all right, guys, you can just either you can turn on your camera and ask a question, or you can just drop in. Go ahead, please.
Sorry, I appreciate there was a lot to cover there, and early in the morning, so I tend to be even more verbose than usual as a result. But thank you for all your comments and interaction in the chat. And yeah, if you have any kind of questions, I would be delighted to take any. Otherwise, I may have PowerPointed out everybody by this point.
No. Any questions, guys? It's your time.
Yeah, you can raise your hand and ask a question.
Please feel free.
Alternatively, I've also posted my details at the end of this slide, and I'm very easy to find online. So if people want to reach out to me directly, I'm very, very happy to talk to people privately as well.
Sure.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, how important, Damian, is user responsibility? Quite a few mentioned this, and digital literacy in combating this menace of misinformation.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it's really fundamental. I think it's very easy for us to say, well, the responsibility lies with Google, or it lies with Facebook, or it lies with these platforms, and to almost kind of just wash our hands of the responsibility of us as individuals. I think all of those different actors in this ecosystem have a responsibility. So when people were saying, about regulators and government and so forth, clearly all of those stakeholders have a role. But I think for us as individual consumers to just lay the blame at others is really absolving ourselves of our own responsibilities. So I think it is incumbent on us to understand a bit about how misinformation spreads, to be critical news consumers, and to really think about what we share before we share it. Not least because we know, and the research reinforces this, that actually we often are more likely to fall for misinformation if it comes from a source that we trust. And that source can be our friends, it can be our professors, it can be our work colleagues, and so forth. And so just kind of being cognizant of that you have an individual responsibility to your friends and your network, as well as a kind of professional responsibility as a journalist, to be kind of careful and cautious and critical consumers of news and information. So I think that the user part of it is really, really important, and a skill that we all need to be constantly developing and get better at.
Okay, folks, any questions from your side?
So I got a question from Ishvarya sent as a DM asking, we see a huge increase of news nowadays on social media, like in Twitter, Instagram, etc. Some of them turn out to be true. How do we navigate through the kind of info dump that we get every second of the day? I think, again, this is another really great question. The volume of information that we are exposed to is overwhelming, exhausting, and it can be very hard, as I talked about, to discern, well, what is real and what's not in that space. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us as journalists is feeling we need to be keeping up with everything, that we need to be on the news all the time, and that kind of fear of missing out, fear of missing a big story, of not seeing the latest kind of commentary or tweets from our colleagues or people we're following and so forth, is very, very real. I absolutely suffer from that FOMO. But I think it goes back to this kind of point 6 I gave in that kind of list of 10 things to do, of like actually just slowing down, of recognizing that particularly kind of for breaking news stories, and the volume of stories that we're exposed to can be exhausting, can make us more susceptible to misinformation. So actually, I think trying to manage your news consumption, trying to consume it in a more considered way, dare I say, even consuming less of it, but doing so in a more kind of targeted manner, I think is one way in which we can avoid being overwhelmed, and it makes it easier for us to potentially avoid falling for misinformation and for sharing it. Actually kind of, slowing down, being more deliberative with what we consume and how we consume it, I think is just good for our mental health regardless, but also I think, really good for us in terms of our own role in managing misinformation. I've got time for one more. I got a DM here from Ruchira. It says, do you think an increase in paid subscription-based journalism can help, at least to some degree, in curbing the spread of inaccurate information? Again, I think this is a great question. Yes, I do think that this can potentially help. I think one of the challenges that we see in the kind of misinformation space is that this is often coming from kind of untrusted sources, sources that might be being created deliberately to provoke a reaction or response, or to drive traffic. We know that there are examples of people all around the world who recognize that they can make money online by creating sensationalist content. And often that sensationalist content is not real, is not accurate, is not grounded in fact. It is just designed to provoke a reaction, to provoke clicks. And of course, this is how the internet business model typically rewards you for traffic rather than for accuracy. And that content is, of course, not behind a paywall. It's not available it's not only subscriber only content. And so I think there is a value there in saying, trust free sources with perhaps a greater element of caution. I mean, it depends on what those sources might be. I mean, Al Jazeera, Reuters, AFP, AP, some of those examples you've talked about, BBC, they're incredibly credible, well-resourced, kind of trusted organizations. But kind of there's a lot of other free sources out there where we're not quite sure the origins and provenance of the company or what their agenda might be. So perhaps honing in on kind of more credible sources, including those that behind paywalls, I think can potentially help. But of course, doesn't mean that subscription-only services don't still make mistakes in terms of poor journalism or misinformation and so forth. But I think it's one way in which you're perhaps more likely to be steered towards more accurate sources.
All right.
I have other questions in DMs here, but I can save those, or if you need to get going, I can reply to people offline.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much for taking time for this. It's been wonderful and it's been so insightful and informative. It would be great if we can share the thing, and I'll share with them, share the presentation. And can I share your email with them, please?
Yes, of course. Please do. Please do. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everybody for all of your interest today.
Good day, sir.
Have a great evening.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Admin, stop recording. Stop recording and close.
Okay.
Close panel.